So many of you still joining. Hello. So, my name is Donia Stefanos. I'm an exam support manager for Cambridge Assessment. With me today and presenting this webinar is Laura Pascoe. Hello,
Hi,
Laura.
everyone. Hi, Danya.
So, Laura Pascoe is a learning experience consultant. She's an experienced teacher, a trainer, a researcher, and an author. She specialises in teacher education, pronunciation, and the use of English as an international language. And she's currently working on a number of projects to develop digital content and tools for distance online language learning. So we're very, very pleased to have Laura with us today to share her expertise with us.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Danya. It's a pleasure.
So on that note, let's get started. Over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Danya. And hello again, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending where you're joining us from. Thanks so much for taking time to come to this webinar today. I know everybody is very busy at the moment, so it's great to see so many of you here. Let's start with a little outline of what we're going to do today. We'll do a quick bit of preparation in a moment. And I'd also like you to have a pen or a pencil and some paper ready, because in this webinar, we're going to do some writing, not only typing. So if you generally take notes on a laptop or a mobile phone or a tablet, I'd like you to also have some paper and something to write with. And you'll see why as we do activities during the webinar. After our quick bit of preparation, we will look at the tools and techniques and tips that I'm sure you're all here for. And I'll show you some extra resources before we have time at the end for questions and answers. So let's begin with our quick bit of prep. Again, please find a piece of paper or some notes, note papers or Post-it notes and a pen and pencil. And I'm also going to ask you a question to begin. This question should appear on your screen any moment now as a poll, and I'd like you just to answer how you feel about teaching writing. If you choose the fourth or the fifth option, please do tell us some more detail in the chat box. So if for you, writing is not enjoyable to teach or your relationship with it is a little bit complicated, please say more. I'd love to know more. I can see some of you answering already. Over half of you say that you enjoy it both online and offline, so that's very promising. And a quarter of you, in addition to that, enjoy teaching writing, but only offline. So we'll see if maybe we can change that a little bit by the end of the webinar. Let's see, for those of you who don't enjoy it or who say it's complicated, oh, there are so many reasons for this. Yes, I know sometimes students' handwriting isn't particularly clear, or it's difficult to get the students motivated. And equally, if you don't enjoy writing, then sometimes it's difficult to teach it and get your students to enjoy it. And yes, some students don't enjoy writing when it's not in their first language, but they might enjoy writing otherwise. So of course it's complicated. There are many reasons, but I'm glad to see already that a lot of you enjoy teaching writing offline or online, but particularly offline. So we'll see if we can change that during the course of the next 45 minutes or so. Now, during this webinar, we're going to look at a range of different activities and techniques and tips. Some of them are especially relevant to technology. So you might see this icon here on the left for those. And some of them are particularly useful for individual study or for group work. So where that is relevant, you'll see this icon on the slide. You don't have to do anything about that. It's just for your reference, particularly if you're looking at these slides later after the webinar and you're trying to remember which things are more useful for certain situations. Now, when you see this symbol, however, you do need to do something. This symbol means it's your turn and we're going to demonstrate an activity together. Some of those activities will require paper. They'll require you to write, not to type. So that's why I'm asking you to have a paper and pencil ready. And please bear in mind that the activities that we're going to use in this webinar are mostly from lower levels. That's simply because it makes them easier and faster to do in a webinar situation where I want to demonstrate the activity with you quickly. But everything that I talked to you about can be used with higher level students as well. And I'll tell you why, or how rather, with each activity that we do. And if you're not sure, you can ask a question, which we will answer at the end. So let's begin. I'd like to introduce you to this word, which is not actually a word here, it's an acronym. I find that with so much information at the moment to remember and to organize and to, new things to learn every day while we're dealing with these unusual circumstances, my memory is failing me quite frequently. And so I find it very useful to have an easy to remember sort of abbreviation or acronym. So each of these letters actually stands for something, one piece of advice, which I'm going to give you in this webinar. And we're going to begin actually not with the W, we're going to begin with the R. And if you stay until the end of this webinar, you'll find out what the W stands for as well. So R is for real. First and foremost, I think the most important thing is to remember what writing your pupils do in real life. Why do they write? How do they write? If I could give you only one piece of advice for teaching writing, it would be this. For engaging and motivating your students, it would be this, is to keep things real. Sometimes, of course, we write for fun, but usually there's a reason. There's a real life purpose. We're writing because it's necessary to write something down. Not to speak or to listen. So let's look at some real life examples. Remember this symbol. This means it's time for you to do an activity. I'd like you to take a piece of paper and make a list. I'd like you to write a list. What are the last 5 things that you in your real life wrote or typed? For example, these are mine. The last 5 things I wrote were these slides for this webinar, a WhatsApp message, an invoice, a shopping list, as we are supposed to be shopping only about once a week at the moment, and my memory is not lasting that long, so I'm keeping a very long list in my kitchen, which I can use when I need to go to the supermarket, and a birthday card. It was my sister's birthday recently. We're not living together, and of course we can't visit, so I wrote a card and put it in the post. I can see some of you recently have written a job application, emails, WhatsApp messages, yes. Shopping lists, yes. Messages, lots of messages. Messages and emails, of course. A poem, oh, interesting. And a diary, exactly. Okay. Oh, congratulations card. Oh, I wonder what you were congratulating somebody on. So you can see, both in your examples and in mine, there's a wide range of things that we write nowadays. Not everything is done digitally. Some of them are handwritten. So in my list, for example, at least 2 of the things, a shopping list and a birthday card, are normally or commonly handwritten. So again, keeping things real for our students doesn't necessarily mean doing everything digitally. And I think it's important to mention this because in the current circumstances, what is creating a lot of stress for teachers is the feeling that we need to do everything online or we need to do everything digitally. And that's not necessary, and it's not necessarily realistic. So in terms of keeping it real, then, what can we do when we have an activity like this? This is an example from the A2 Key for Schools exam of a task in which learners have to write an email to their friend Pat about their shopping trip tomorrow. Now, when this appears in an exam handbook or in an exam course book or in a lesson where you talk about the exam all the time, it can potentially feel a little bit dry or even a little bit scary. A lot of learners get very nervous about exams. So looking at this, how can we keep it real, particularly when we're teaching in an online environment? Well, it's not as hard as it may seem. For starters, pupils could email you. You could be Pat, and they send you their email, and they genuinely send it as an email from an email account if you are, if your school is set up to allow that. Rather than handwriting an email, they actually type it the same way that they would with any other email they've sent recently. If you have a lot of students and you're not able to respond to all these emails, or if you want to encourage more collaborative work and peer feedback, they could email each other. Again, as they do ordinarily anyway. They could also potentially send a text message if this is something they're comfortable doing or something they often do. Even though this task for the exam is about writing an email, in real life, you might well text your friend the morning of your shopping trip and just check, are we still going shopping today? Where shall we meet? Etc. So you can make this more real by making it more realistic, by making it more similar to the things that they do in real life. If you, for any reason, don't have the infrastructure or the resources or so on to set up this kind of email exchange, you can also connect your students with other students in another school who have the same challenges and who want to work together over distance. And again, at the moment, this is a good time to try this out because so many of us are adjusting to working over extreme distance. The Penfriends website is quite simple to use. You can register your school. So this is not something that individual learners have to do. Something you can do for your whole school or your class. You find a partner school who also registered, and then you connect the two, and you can either post cards in the post, or you can upload them so that you receive each other's messages digitally. And if you're not sure what to write about, there are quite a few themes suggested on the website that you can choose from, which is a good place to start if your pupils aren't familiar with this, or if you can't think of something, that's engaging for them. They could choose a theme, something they want to write about. And it also makes it easier for their pen friends to find the message they want. So just by giving them some choice and by connecting them with peers, you're making the task of writing much more real for them. These are the kinds of people they might want to communicate with anyway. Somebody in the chat box mentioned something about giving feedback. Later in this webinar, we're going to look at some examples of giving feedback on writing, whether it's electronic or written. So I'll hold that question for now. One other task that I'd like to show as an example of keeping things real is a narrative task. So a number of exam tasks and writing tasks in general involve telling a story, whether it's a fictional story, constructing a narrative and coming up with ideas, or whether it's a description of something that has happened in your life. Even if it's an email or a postcard, often there's a story element kind of explaining where you went, what you saw, and so on. Again, students need to be familiar with this task format. If they're going to take the exam, they need to know how long it takes them to write 35 words. They need to practice coming up with ideas about the pictures here, which they're using as prompts for their story. They need to practice the language required for storytelling. But all of this is not restricted to an example exam task, and it's not restricted to an online or an offline environment. So how can we make this more real? How can we help the students develop the skills of imagination, idea generation, narrative writing, and just the curiosity involved in constructing a story? Well, there are a few things that you can do. And again, we're talking here about making it real. And again, this to me is the best and simplest way that you can engage and motivate learners in writing tasks, is making it real. So here, they could find real images. They don't necessarily have to use the prompts in this exam task. They can do an exam style activity using pictures from books or magazines they have at home, potentially from a non-print source. So if they're watching a television show, they could take 3 pictures of scenes and then write the narrative, write the story, which might help them at least at earlier stages if they're having difficulty generating the ideas. So they are able to observe the narrative in one medium and then write about it in another medium. And of course, they can also use real images, which they themselves drew, or photos that they took. So something that they produce, something that they create. And they could either use this for their own narrative practice, Or they could provide pictures as prompts for their peers. So you could ask them to select 3 images and then swap them with a peer, and that peer, that other student, has to decide what's the connection between the pictures. What story is there here? What story can I tell? So these are all ways of making a task feel more real and less like an exam, while preserving the requirements of the exam and developing the skills that they will need when they come to do their exam. Now, again, this example here comes from the A2 Key for Schools exam handbook, but at all levels, students are often required to write extended pieces, including some narrative. So this could easily be adapted for other levels, and even for a general free writing task if you're trying to encourage creativity in your students. This is a very adaptable activity. So I want to show you an example of making this real. Here are 3 photographs of mine. So these are photos that I took last week here in England, where I am at the moment, on my daily walk in the countryside. And that's all I'm going to tell you. The rest is up to your imagination, your creativity. But I can tell you that these are real. Okay, these are my photos. There is a story behind the photos, but I'm not going to tell you yet. That is your job. So you recognize this icon now. I'm going to give you a choice in the medium that you prefer writing in now. So you can either write this on paper, or you can type it on your screen, or type it in the chat box. I'd like you to do this exam task. You are to write 35 words or more to tell the story that is shown in these 3 pictures. Now, this is a low-level task. It's only 35 words, and you are all very experienced English users and teachers, so I'm not going to give you very long to do this. I'm going to give you about 1 minute. So please write your story either on paper or in the chat box, or on your computer, your phone, wherever you're most comfortable. Okay, I'm looking forward to your stories. Oh, some fantastic stories here. You went for a walk and found a nest. There was a baby bird in it. You picked it up and took it home to make it feel comfortable and warm. Went for a quiet walk, and on the path I found an injured bird that I took home to care for. I was walking in a wood when suddenly I saw a duckling in a bush. I wrapped it into my scarf and I took it home. Now it's in my garden on its favorite bench. On the way to wood, I saw this small creature alone, abandoned. So on and on. I was walking in the woods. Poor thing was lost and injured. Exactly, you've got the idea. And I'm very amazed to see the level of drama involved in these stories. One person has commented, I do not understand the 3rd picture. For the purpose of this task, that's not a problem. And I think it's important actually to mention that now. If your students look at this and they're a little confused or they don't understand, at this point, that is the purpose of the task. Here and in the exam, they're not being tested on getting the correct answer about what the picture shows. They're being tested on their ability to write a narrative. So actually, any ideas they have at this moment are valid. This could be a tragic story. It could be a happy story. If there's something unclear in the picture, they can imagine what they think it is, and they won't be penalized if they think it's something different. What's important is that they're able to construct a narrative to tell a story that is coherent, well organized, accurate in its use of language, and so on. Now, in a moment, I'm going to tell you what the I stands for in our acronym, but I think this is a nice example of a combination of R for real and I for the other thing, which we'll look at in a moment, which is that After your pupils have stopped writing, maybe they can read the story. It's not necessary to provide this, but this is one way you can do the activity, is to provide them with the true story. So I'll give you a moment to read this story. I wrote this before the webinar. So there's actually quite a lot of room for creativity here. And because there is no wrong answer, it's just a story. In this case, they're comparing what they imagine with what really happened to me. But it doesn't matter if they imagine something completely different, because the purpose of the task was to practice their narrative writing in the style that they will need when they do their exam. And I hope that you would agree that this kind of use of real images with a bit of mystery is more real and engaging than a string of cartoon pictures which they're not connected with. The point is not that those cartoon pictures are not engaging or realistic, but that you may need to work to create that connection to help them see why they're interesting. And you can see the kind of language this generates, even at a very low level. So this text I wrote to be mainly at about A1 level of the CEFR, so really very low. And if you're teaching classes with quite mixed abilities or with weaker students or less confident students, they can still generate lots of language. You can see here some simple time expressions, some connecting words, some irregular past simple verbs, and also some vocabulary which probably they had to look up in a dictionary because it's not very low level or it's very specific. But if your students are trying to express an idea that they really want to express, they will have the motivation to look up those words. And of course, because this is a very open-ended task, there's a lot of freedom for the students to work as hard as they can and be as creative as they want and use whatever words they have. And you can see this in your examples in the chat box. The range of vocabulary that you're using is a much higher level than this because you're able to do that and because I didn't place any limitations on your creativity. So this is just one way to make a familiar exam task much more real. This is not restricted to the online environment, of course, but at the moment when students and teachers might be feeling a little bit disconnected or isolated, this is a nice way to bring ourselves together again and share our stories and share what we're interested in and so on. Which brings me to the I in my abbreviation. I is for interesting. You know your pupils better than anyone. You know what interests them, and you also know what you would normally do to generate interest if you were trying to make something in their class more engaging, more motivating for them. Just because you're teaching online now, that knowledge doesn't disappear. You still know your students very well. We just may need to find ways to provoke that interest that are different to what we would normally do. We've seen some examples already, so giving pupils a real reason to communicate is one easy way to make something more interesting. For example, by emailing a pen friend in another country, or by emailing the teacher. So you know that a real person is going to read what you wrote, and it feels more like real communication. It can also be interesting to connect pupils with peers in other places because they don't know what those people are going to say. Their lifestyles might be very different. And of course, there's also a motivation to use English if the person you're writing to doesn't have any other language in common with you. Using the pupil's own photos and stories, as I said, is not only real, but also interesting. And creating a sense of mystery is one of the easiest ways that you can make things interesting. So any kind of task where the students have to speculate about something, think about something, come up with ideas, and then find out whether those ideas were either correct or similar, that will generate some sense of mystery. And it's quite simple to do. You simply withhold a little bit of information at the beginning that's not necessary to complete the task, and then you reveal it later. So let's do an example. In this case, that I'm about to show you, unfortunately, we're not able to demonstrate this today because it involves a mystery guest, and there are over 2,000 of you from all over the world in this webinar, and I was not able to find a mystery guest that I knew you would all recognize. But what you can do that uses technology well, if you're currently teaching online, is to invite a mystery guest to attend a live lesson. This is much easier to do when all they have to do is click a link and log in. It's much harder to do in a physical school where maybe you can't find a person who can travel to your classroom, and there may be other limitations. When this person joins your lesson, you need to make sure that they are displayed as mystery guest. It doesn't say their name when they log in, and they don't switch on their camera or microphone yet. So the students know that somebody is there. There's a mystery guest invited by the teacher, but they don't know who this person is. What they do is they prepare some questions for the guest. So they're going to conduct an interview with the guest. Of course, this could be done in speaking, but if you're trying to develop writing skills, a good way to do this is in the breakout rooms to get them to write their questions, not because you would always use the questions in writing. Sometimes you would use them as speaking, but because this is a kind of collaborative writing task. It allows the students to draft what they're writing. It allows for peer correction. It allows for listing more questions than you need, so you actually generate quite a lot of language. And then they conduct the interview by writing the questions in the chat box. This is not dissimilar to how a lot of professional interviews are done. So particularly if you're working with slightly older or higher level students who are maybe thinking about pursuing a career in journalism or anything where they might need to interview people, it's not uncommon for this professional use of interviews to be written, because people often can't meet or connect at the same time. So they write their questions, they get a response, they write back and forth, and then they edit everything together into, say, an article or a magazine column. So this is done in writing. The interview is conducted live through the chat box. So again, written, the guest posts replies. And you can continue this for as long or as short as you want. But one way that I like to do it is as the 20 questions game, which if you're not familiar with, you basically have a limit of 20 questions and then you must guess. So you could continue for 20 questions until the pupils feel ready to guess the identity of the mystery guest. And then, of course, you culminate by switching on the webcam and the microphone and revealing the mystery guest. Now, I've already said that in this case, it was impossible to find a mystery guest who I felt confident you would all know and recognize and practice with. But if you're doing this in your context, you could invite perhaps a teacher who worked with the same class in the previous year, and maybe they don't see that teacher very much anymore. You could maybe invite a teacher who teaches a different subject in the school. You could potentially invite a member of the local community, somebody who your students all know, particularly if you're working in a context which is very, very socially close, where people know each other and they recognize each other, somebody like a post delivery worker or somebody in a shop and so on. So again, it's a very simple way to develop some sense of mystery, but it makes the communication feel more real and it makes it more interesting. And of course, after this, you can follow up with another writing task. For example, they can write up the interview as an article, like I was just suggesting. You could also adapt an exam class in order to use the concept of a mystery guest. So here's an example of an email task from the B1 Preliminary for Schools exam, where the exam candidate has to write an email in response to this person about this subject. So you could change this and make it relate to your mystery guest, and then they write an email to your mystery guest. If you have a class of quite mixed abilities, you could also divide the class where the slightly weaker pupils or less confident pupils have the job of rewriting the exam task. So they have the structure of the example, but they have to substitute their own ideas and language to make it look like an email from the mystery guest. And then the stronger or the more confident pupils respond to that email task. So again, there's a bit more of a realistic exchange. Or you could invite the pupils simply to write an email thanking your guest for their participation in the lesson, which again has a real world significance and is more interesting than creating a task from nothing. So there are lots of ways that you can adapt this. And again, this works for any level because the results of the students' writing are quite open according to what language they have available. So this is an example from a B1 exam, but you could also use this for students at higher or lower levels. Okay, how are we doing? We're about halfway through the webinar, and we're also coming up to halfway through our acronym. So the T, I wonder if you can guess what the T is for. I will tell you now, it does not stand for what you think it stands for. It's not technology, and it's not time. I'm cheating a little bit. It stands for 3 different things: tasks, techniques, and tools, in that order. The important point I want to make here is that you start with learning, not with technology. And again, in the current circumstances, a lot of people are being forced to familiarize themselves very fast with a technological platform. But it doesn't change the reason we're all there. The reason we are trying to continue education and keep our schools open is because of the initial learning task. We want to learn, we want to develop and educate our pupils. The tools we can choose according to the task. So if we start by asking, like in any context, online or offline, what aspect of writing skills are we trying to develop? And possibly which part of the exam are we practicing? In answer to those questions, we can then choose a technique. So what is the best way to do this? If we're trying to develop narrative writing skills, what's the best way to do this? If we're trying to practice part 1 of the writing exam at a specific level, what's the best way to do this? And also in terms of techniques, what techniques do we already use effectively? So what do we already know about our pupils and about what works for them? Then we can choose a tool. So once we know why we're there, what are we trying to develop, and what normally works for this, what's the best way to do it, then we can consider whether we even need a specific tool and technology. And what's really important is yes or no, will the technology actually help them do it more easily? And very importantly, do the learners have access to this technology? There is some fantastic technology available, some really interesting tools, but they will not be available to all of our pupils. At the moment, when a lot of us are working from home, there are lots of issues to do with infrastructure, resources, internet connectivity. So we need to ask ourselves, before we get too excited about using technology, if our learners can actually access this, and will it really help them? Let's do an example. You'll remember this email. This is the task I showed you. It's the writing part 1 task from the B1 preliminary for schools exam. And let's imagine that the pupils wrote their response and then they sent me a photo of their first draft. Here's one I prepared earlier. So you can see a pupil has written on the paper. There's a couple reasons why I like them to write on this paper is that for exam practice, they need to know how it looks. This is what the exam answer sheet looks like. I've printed this at home from the handbook that comes with the B1 preliminary for schools exam. Another good reason is that by doing this on paper, they're not only practicing what they might do in their real exam if they're taking the written form, but they can also see like how big is their handwriting. If they know how long this is when they type it because the software tells them how many words, that doesn't mean that they will know in a written exam if they've written enough, because they need to get a sense of just how much space their handwriting takes. So I like to do this in writing if I can. So let's imagine the students have written this, they've taken a photo, they've emailed it to me. I want to give them feedback, and I want to give them feedback so they can improve what they wrote and then produce a final draft. So they send me the picture. It looks like this on my screen. and I'm going to give you a task to do. I want to know how could you give feedback on this task. You'll need a piece of paper and a pen. I'd like you to draw a spider diagram. So start with a piece of paper like this. In the middle of my paper, it says how to give writing feedback. You have 1 minute to write some ideas of your own as a teacher. How could you give feedback on this piece of writing? What would you do? So just 1 minute to generate your ideas. So take a piece of paper. Remember, please do this on paper. I will explain why in a moment. Okay, just 30 seconds. Okay, and my demonstration student, who you met earlier, Danya, is going to come back. I'd like you to stop writing now. Hi, Danya. Thank you for coming back. Let me just make our cameras a little bit bigger. So to demonstrate to you attending this webinar how you could conduct feedback on a task a little bit like this, you could switch on their webcams and then share, like so. So Danya, could you hold up yours to the webcam? Great. Don't worry if you can't read all the details. I'll tell you now. So Danya says, email general comments, post comments to students on your platform, use colors to highlight problems, or use exam criteria, highlight where students are so they can continue to improve. Thank you, Danya. And mine similarly says you could use a correction code, you could circle and correct the mistakes. You could also just answer the email. So don't give them language feedback, just give them a response, and their task is to continue. You could give them a mark, similar to what they would have in the exam, or a mystery option number 5, which I'll show you in a moment. Thank you so much, Danya, for demonstrating with us. So you can see that you don't necessarily have to use technology in order to do a task with your students. And if you have a smaller group, they could switch on their webcams and show their work. Danya, if you're still there, could I ask you to switch your microphone off, please, while we continue? Thank you very much. Let's have a look at mystery option number 5. So I could do this. I could write notes on every photo that the students send and then send it back to the pupils. However, and this is where it comes back to being realistic. In order to do this, which I might do in a classroom if they submitted writing on paper, in this case, I would have to print everything. I don't have a very good printer at home. Also, I'm sitting at my computer all day and my hands hurt and I don't want to do more stuff typing or highlighting on screen. So one thing that I like to do personally is give video feedback. There are lots of tools that you can use for this. 2 that I like using are called Snagit and Loom. I'm going to show you an example in a moment. The way that this works is that the tool records what's on your screen and it also records your voice. In the case of Loom, and I'm not sure about Snagit, it can also record your face if you like. So what I do when I do this is I project onto I display on my computer screen on my own. This is not in a live lesson. This is in my time. I open their email, I find the picture, and I open it on my screen, and I put it next to the task. And then I talk to them. Of course, they're not there. I'm making them a recording. It's like leaving a voicemail. I look at what they've sent me, I talk to them, and while I'm talking, the tool is recording what's on my screen and it's recording my voice. So I can send that to them, and it just feels a little bit more personal. It also, for me, takes me much less time than writing. Now, you will receive these slides after the webinar, so you will get this link. Don't worry about it now. The link is on the slide. There's an example that I've made earlier that you can watch of how this looks. works. And for now, I'll just tell you that this is how this particular tool works. There are lots of different ones. Of course, you can make videos on your phone or anything else, but I like screen recording. I just find it easy to use. You can record your screen and your webcam if you want students to see your face. You can change the title of your video so you can, it will automatically generate something, but you can organize it in a way that's clear for you and clear for them. I personally find this faster than traditionally marking. I don't know if you can see here that this video is 1 minute and 52 seconds long. You can also record your voice speaking slowly and clearly, and then when the students receive the video, they can play it faster if they are able to listen faster and they want to. And the website automatically creates a link that you can send them. So you don't actually have to do very much technologically. You just press a big red button that says record, and then you record what's on your screen. So after the webinar, I'd encourage you to have a look at what this looks like and follow that link and see it. If let's imagine you have quite a few students, or you have students who really need a lot of work and you want them to do more tasks in their own time, and you don't have or don't need or don't want to give them lots and lots of verbal feedback, they can also use Write and Improve, which is quite a nice website that uses a sort of artificial intelligence mechanism and a database, a huge database of language, to take the task a student has written and give them automated feedback. So it doesn't require a teacher to monitor. It has a huge range of tasks. This is an example, again, of an email, because I've shown you several emails now. There are tasks at many different levels: beginner, intermediate, advanced. There's also some for business and some just for fun. And what the student does is they type their answer to the task and then they click submit. And the machine gives them feedback. So the feedback will be on a range of different things like vocabulary and grammar, and it's written in a way that really makes them reflect. It doesn't just confirm whether something was correct or not. It gives them a question to think about. It gives them an example if necessary, and then they can resubmit their work and try again. So this they can do on their own. You don't have to have a teacher there. So it's really good if you have maybe 1 or 2 students in a big class who are struggling and need more personal practice, and for whatever reason you're not able to give them all the attention you'd like to. They can do extra practice this way on their own. Okay, so almost at the end of our word. What is the E for? The E is for energy, of course. Now, one of the difficulties of teaching online particularly is that it often involves a lot of sitting, a lot of typing, and in the case of teaching writing, maybe even more typing or more writing, especially if you're doing writing practice in a group in your live lessons. So we're going to move on to our final activity. Remember this icon. This means it's your job, and we're going to inject a little bit of energy into the end of this webinar. What I want you to do is, again, prepare your pen or pencil and prepare 5 small pieces of paper. Sticky is better. So if you have Post-it notes like this, that would be great. When you have your 5 small pieces of paper, you need to make sure that your pen or pencil actually works. And on each piece of paper, you're going to write a word, and I will tell you what that word is. Now, you can do this however you like. I don't know what sort of room environment you're all sitting in, but let's imagine that your students are able to get up and move around their room. And if you can, I encourage you to do that now. So you should unplug your headphones because you're going to move and you need to still be able to hear my voice. So you need to unplug your headphones and we'll do an example together. I'll give you a word. And very quickly, I'll give you another word, and then another word, and then another word. And as you get each word, you have to write it really fast on a Post-it, and you need to stick it on something in the room that represents that word. For example, if I say your first word is softest, really, really fast, you write the word softest. There it is. you take the note and you go around the room looking for the softest thing in the room and you stick it on that thing. So here is my example. I've stuck mine on this little panda. This is the softest thing in my room. So if you're ready, you need your notes, you need your pen. I'm going to give you 4 more words and you're going to move around and stick it on that thing. So in your room, what is the darkest thing? Find the darkest corner of the room, the darkest place, the darkest thing, and stick a note on that. Next, I want you to find the smallest thing in the room. So you need to write on your note, smallest, and run and stick it on the smallest thing in the room that you can possibly find. Somebody says, my cat. Is that the softest or the smallest? Or the darkest? Next, the most interesting thing or person in the room. So quick, go, 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 most interesting, and label the most interesting thing in the room. Maybe the most interesting book, maybe the most interesting picture, maybe the most interesting person. And finally, the most comfortable. So look around your room. What is the most comfortable place to sit? And stick a note to that, most comfortable. And stop, time's up, come back, sit down, plug in your earphones. Now, you'll notice that I wanted to save this slide until after the activity because part of this activity is encouraging your students to work on their spelling. Now, this is one area that I find often gets missed when we're teaching online because so many devices now correct our spelling for us. But if your students are going to take an exam in writing, even at higher levels, they often still have difficulty with common spellings. A lot of exam preparation materials will tell you words that are commonly misspelled so you can practice them. And you want your students to get into the habit of quickly writing and not cheating and looking up the spelling or not letting their device correct it for them. And particularly at low levels and for younger learners, this is a really nice activity. It's also useful for learners at lower levels of proficiency and learners who have difficulty sitting still. And it injects a little bit of energy into the lesson, which you can really use at specific transitional points in the lesson, like at the start or at the end or in the middle. But I want to specify that this is not only an activity for students who can only write single words. Even at higher levels, remember the E is for energy. So it doesn't matter what level of proficiency you are, it's still difficult to sit at a laptop for an hour during a lesson. Similarly, even at higher levels of proficiency, as I say, some students will have difficulty with spelling, and you don't want them to lose time just wondering and thinking, overthinking, let's say. What this also does is forces written fluency. So what you're going to find, and again, this applies to all levels of proficiency, what you're going to find is that some students find it difficult to complete their writing within the time limits of the exam. So making things a little bit quicker, a little bit more competitive, encourages your students to just write something fast, but something meaningful, and apply it around their room. And just get them thinking less about the kind of stress of writing and writing lengthy texts, and more about the fluency of just getting the words onto paper. And of course, depending on the vocabulary that you choose, they could finish with a room labeled full of English words. So these are things that will still be there after the lesson and maybe can help them continue learning. So there's a lot of flexibility in this activity. Now, you may remember, if you were here at the beginning, that we actually started with R. We didn't start with W. So we're going to finish this webinar with the last remaining letter of my acronym. And this stands for wrong time, wrong place. So another silent W, just like in the word write. It's really, really important to remember that when you're teaching writing, even if you are teaching in an online setting, not everything has to be done digitally. Not everything has to be done in a live class. So there's lots of reasons why this is not always possible or necessary or helpful. If you require collaboration, great, do your activity in a live class. But if you require independent concentration on a task, then that's something the students can do independently. They can do it in their own time. Students with specific learning difficulties might also benefit or not from the technological environment. So think about students who might need extra time, who might need to change the size of the text, the colors of the material, and so on. There may be privacy issues, both in a digital sense of submitting writing online, but also in a personal sense. Maybe your students don't have a private room to study in, and maybe it's not convenient to do certain tasks in a live class or do them digitally. And similarly, physical and environmental limitations. If you're asking your students to do something to develop their writing, which requires a reliable, fast internet speed, and they don't have it, then that's something we need to think about when we're setting our tasks. And remember as well, of course, their exam might be on paper. So it's really important, if this is the case, that they still have an opportunity to practice writing on paper, even though at the moment we're doing a lot of our instruction online. If you're preparing them for a written exam, then they still need to know how quickly they can write, how big their writing is, how good their spelling is, and so on. And a lot of these can be misleading if developed in a digital context. So they will still need paper sometimes. Okay, so let's finish. I'm just going to show you very quickly some extra resources that can help you, and then we'll have time for some questions. You're going to receive these slides after the webinar with your certificate, so don't worry about making notes now. But these two websites have a lot of lesson plans and class materials that you can use for students of all levels. There's also a new bank of self-access learning materials. These are lesson plans that have been written. They've been structured in a way that you might structure a teacher-facing lesson, but they've been designed for students working on their own. So they have links to things like Write and Improve. They have tips for students to reflect on their learning, to work with peers, and so on. There's also the website for supporting every teacher, which you can access through this link or through this QR code. Excuse me. You'll see that it looks like this when you load it. And if you scroll down, you'll find this menu, which has links to a lot of the things that we've mentioned in this webinar, like Write and Improve, a calendar of webinars, also a support pack for teachers, which looks like this, so you'll recognize it when you see it. It has lots of access to all of the exam prep materials, lots of digital resources, lots of ideas and tools. And finally, there's a huge bank of free teaching resources. So you click on that link and you can select which exam you want to focus on or which kind of resource you're looking for. If you're looking for lesson plans, it will highlight the ones that are used for online teaching particularly, or which have tips for online teaching. And when you open one of these lesson plans, you'll see all the normal things you expect, like the aims of the lesson and the materials you require. And you'll also see this column of online options. So you can follow this lesson plan, excuse me, in an ordinary context. And also you'll see these online options, like students can upload an article or students can take a photo of something they've written. So we've got about 5 minutes left for any questions that you might have. Thank you so much for your attention in this webinar. I hope some of those ideas are useful. And good luck with preparing your students for writing if you're teaching in an online context now. I believe Danya and her colleagues have been helping collect some questions during the webinar, so I'm happy to take those now.
Hi Laura, thank you. I do have a few questions here. If you have any more questions, now is the time to type them. So type any more questions that you have now in the chat box. Okay, so we've had some questions about giving feedback. One question is, one of your suggestions was correction codes. Are correction codes useful? How are they useful in giving feedback to writing?
Personally, I think they're quite useful if they're limited. I wouldn't suggest you use a code with 25 different symbols. But the reason I like using a code is it helps me as a teacher draw my students' attention to specific areas, especially if they're quite frequent mistakes, like they make the same spelling mistake several times or they make the same grammatical mistake. But I like the code nature because it forces the students to self-correct. So I say, okay, there's a grammar mistake here, but I don't tell them the correction. And I find that really useful for making my students more self-aware as writers.
Okay, so encouraging learner autonomy at the same time.
Absolutely.
Okay, and is it possible to overcorrect a student's writing?
I think so. I think so more as a student than as a teacher. Sometimes I found it frustrating as a language student to write something that had been designed to be very real and engaging, and then when I get it back, there's no response to my ideas. There's just loads and loads and loads and loads of corrections. I knew it wouldn't be perfect. That's why I'm taking language lessons. I know that I'll make some mistakes, but I feel that after a point, I want some feedback on the content and not just the accuracy. So in my personal opinion, yes, it is possible to overcorrect.
I think that's really interesting that you reflected on that from a student's perspective, because we can forget to do that as teachers, can't we?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's easy, especially when we're busy.
And it's quite overwhelming if you get a piece of paper back full of mistakes. You don't know where to focus. Okay, and let's see if we have any other questions. Okay, we have a question about the support materials and the lesson plans. Are these available for all levels? So I think I can answer this.
I think that's your question, Danya. Yeah. Go ahead.
So yes, they are. The lesson plans are available for all levels. So starting from pre-A1 starters all the way up to C1 advanced. Okay, and the self-study plans are specifically for B2 first for schools and C1 advanced. And there are more being added every week.
Thanks, Danya.
And now the questions seem to have stopped and there are just lots of thank yous and lovely comments about your webinar. So thank you very much. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much to everybody who attended. It's great to see so many of you coming to these events and continuing to develop your teaching when I know the circumstances are very challenging for a lot of us. So thank you so much for taking the time. And I hope I'll see you again.
The next webinar on Thursday is about listening. So we hope to see you there. I'm going to switch off my camera.
I'll switch off my microphone and camera now too. Thank you so much to both of you for hosting. Bye, everyone.